So there's no way that I'm going to talk to you for an hour about this exhibit, and there's no way also that I can replicate the kind of order and precision of what I wrote 13 years ago in this essay, which really does, I reread it recently, and it does a really good job of describing the whole situation behind the trip, a lot of the history behind it. So I encourage you, if you're going to do tours of this, or just for your own interest, to read this. There's 2 copies in the library. You may have a copy of this if you were around at the museum in 2003, because that is when we first displayed this album. So it was given to us in 2000. We spent a couple years doing research and creating this amazing catalog. And then it was on view here in 2003. And then it's been to a couple different great places since then. It went to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. It went to the Crocker Museum in Sacramento. Most recently it was at the Loveland Museum. So it's been around a little bit to a few different venues, which is really exciting for us. It's such a nice, compact thing, just in its own narrative, and then in its physical self, it fits in 2 boxes that are easy to send to other venues. So it's been a really amazing object for us to have. When we got it, it was actually a photo album. So it was pages that were, luckily for us, laced together. So we could unlace it and then frame each page and display it, like you see it on the wall here. It was given to us, like I said, in 2000 by Sarah Sage McAlpin, who was David McAlpin's second wife. And McAlpin is featured in this album a number of times, but he's that handsome fellow over there with the scruffy beard. And it was facilitated, this donation was facilitated by the Dellenbachs, who I'm sure many of you know, who helped support the library and who were longtime and early supporters of the museum. And they argued to Sarah Sage McAlpin, wouldn't it be amazing for this wonderful album that really documents a love and passion for the West to come to the West and belong to an institution that would show it off and display it with some regularity. And this was in argument against giving it where most of McAlpin's stuff went, was to Princeton and to other East Coast institutions. David McAlpin was a cousin of Godfrey and Helen Rockefeller, so it's all this Rockefeller family dynamics. And so we're really lucky to have this album here, handmade photo album by Ansel Adams that he created for David McAlpin. He also created 2 other albums for the members of this trip. One went to Georgia O'Keeffe, and one went to the Rockefellers. The one that he gave to O'Keeffe is at the O'Keeffe Museum in their archives, and we don't know where the Rockefeller one is. But we're lucky to have this one. I also don't know for sure if they're all exactly the same. That he might have made different ones for the different participants based on what photos he had available. So it'd be really interesting at a certain point to compare this one with the O'Keeffe one to see if he put more pictures of O'Keeffe in that. He certainly put a lot of photos of David McAlpin in this one, so you could assume that maybe he tailored it a little bit. And also that's a good assumption to make because this was not, kind of a one-off activity for Ansel Adams. He used to lead these throngs of groups of the Sierra Club through Yosemite to many of these same places. And when he was kind of in charge of getting them all up in the morning and getting going on the trail, so he was kind of like the trail boss of this crew. He was helping out. He was also taking photos the whole time. So when you got back from your trip with the Sierra Club through Yosemite, you could go to Ansel Adams' studio and pick out some photos to create your own kind of album of the trip. So it was something that he was used to doing. It's something he enjoyed doing. But this, obviously, is a very specific, special album for a specific, special member of the trip. One of the reasons that the members of this trip are so important, in addition to Georgia O'Keeffe, is that both McAlpin and the Rockefellers were instrumental in creating the photography department at the MoMA in New York. So they were very interested at this time in valuing photography as a fine art, and so Ansel Adams was obviously very interested in them and in being friends with them and in courting them, and this album that he prepared was obviously, they were friends, but it was obviously something nice that he could give them. So, that's what I'm going to say about this album. You see in many of the pages there's little handwritten notations that would have been written by Ansel Adams himself. The order of the album mirrors the order of their trip through Yosemite, and I was able to recreate that order, I think pretty specifically, pretty well, pretty accurately, when we did this in 2003. I still think that's a pretty good representation of where they went, and it was probably a pretty typical way that you would travel through Yosemite if you were doing a pack trip. If you came and saw Miss Grandy, I call her that because my son is in her 4th grade class. He always calls her Miss Grandy. Betsy Grandy was here, and she talked about her life in Yosemite as a young person and just how much more of a kind of small town, less regulated, more freedom sort of place it was at that point, and which makes sense. She said today it would be very difficult to do this kind of trip with pack mules and kind of on this informal basis that it would be today. Today you would need many more backcountry permits. I don't know if they allow mules to go back there anymore. So this is definitely a moment in time that this occurred. But she made me think about this trip in a little bit different way. To me, taking all these people to help you and taking all these mules to pack all your gear just seemed like this luxurious way to go into the backcountry. But she said at that point, she and her family would go into the backcountry and they'd take a couple mules and they would pack all their stuff. And so that aspect of it was much more typical and taken for granted. What's not taken for granted is the fact that, you know, they had a whole staff that helped them on this trip. So they weren't getting to a place and setting up camp. They were getting to a place and taking photos. You know, the pack train might have gone on ahead of them to set up, so that they had the freedom to enjoy and to walk around with Ansel Adams and learn all about Yosemite, which is what he really wanted them to do. This group had taken a trip the year before through the Southwest, and so they'd gotten to see some of Georgia O'Keeffe's favorite territory, and Ansel Adams really clearly enjoyed that, but he wanted to share with these people Yosemite, which was the really special place in his heart, just like the Southwest was a special place for O'Keeffe. So he wanted them to come and experience the beauty of this nature that he felt so passionate about. And so that's why he organized this trip. He was reportedly a little bit disappointed because Georgia O'Keeffe didn't bring any art materials along. He wanted her to come and like do the Half Dome and do waterfalls and do all this stuff that he was so interested in. But he finally, sort of a couple of years later, I think, resigned himself to the fact, and he wrote, Yosemite for her was just like a beautiful respite, where she could just go along and enjoy what she was seeing, because her heart was really in the Southwest. So that was a nice way for him to...
Adam, do we know if when they did the Southwest trip, whether or not everyone was engaged in photography or painting or whatever, so indeed this would have been a disappointment when she showed up without any...
I don't know how much... He was definitely engaged in photography on that trip. There's some nice photos from that earlier excursion. So I don't know if during that trip she brought along her materials to do stuff, but that was kind of her space, so it wouldn't be surprising if she didn't. Maybe was more of a solitary creator who didn't want to create her artwork with all these people around. He, on the other hand, one of the points about him leading those Sierra Club trips, he took some amazing photos on those trips with 100 people around around him, and then those became what he used in his fine art photography. So he didn't mind having all of that, all the people around. He wasn't the solitary artist out on the point taking a photo. He was doing all this other stuff and taking pictures at the same time. Which is, if you think about him as a kind of hyperactive person, that kind of makes sense. You know, he was bouncing around all over the place and doing all kinds of things at once. Multitasking, we would call it today. Okay, so he got this group together. I was very excited to show Georgia O'Keeffe Yosemite. And from all reports, she completely enjoyed it. There are a few paintings around, many in the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, of some really tall waterfalls that you can maybe guess were inspired by this trip. But it didn't seem like she did anything directly when she was on this trip. We tried to borrow those too, because that would have been really fun to have her waterfalls and this exhibit. But apparently the O'Keeffe Museum this year was just inundated with requests. So, our requests. But what is also really great about this album is that it shows all of the things that Ansel Adams was known for in his photography, plus there's all this other fun stuff that he included. So I'll walk around a little bit, and you can either follow me or stay seated. So Ansel Adams was both a fan of those huge landscapes like you're familiar with, of Half Dome or whatever. So there's a few of those in this album. Beautifully composed landscapes. He was really interested in the patterns of light and dark. And he also was a huge proponent. His photographic theory, which is a kind of a basic visual theory of composition that many people use, was a theory of thirds. So if you look at these photos, you really can often divide them into 3 different zones. So there'll be a band of light down here, a darker band, and then a brighter band, for example, as a way to divide the picture up. That to him was just a hallmark of good design, and so that's what he was looking for in a well-balanced photo. And I think you can see in many of these, that just makes for a really classic kind of image. This one, we were able to, he was also horrible at dating his work, but we were able to help the Ansel Adams studio date this picture, which they reproduce to this day. You can buy an Ansel Adams gallery print of it. We helped them date it to this trip, so that was a really fun outcome of this research project. There's just some cool things to note, like the way that he's framed this picture of Half Dome. He's very carefully put this tree within the confines of it. All of this stuff he would have done very consciously. He's not taking random snapshots. You know, he's thinking about the composition. He's wanting to compose it like you would compose a painting or like you would compose a sculpture. So, it's got these great landscapes that he was very good at, very well known for. He was also very interested in creating abstract patterns, or finding abstract patterns in nature. So looking around at the bark of a tree and really focusing in on that, and then getting you to think about that as a pattern. Some of the pictures are almost completely abstract. So there's a beautiful one over there of the base of a tree trunk, where all he really wants you to do is think about the beauty of nature and the way that nature makes these really cool patterns. The same is true of the bark in this one. He also wants to communicate some of that grandeur and majesty of these enormous trees that he was seeing and that he so loved out in Yosemite. I got to go to the Center for Creative Photography, which is in Tucson, and see some of the negatives from this trip that he didn't reproduce. And so that was really fun, because then I could look at this rock, which if you just look at it in this photo, you can't tell how big it is. You know, it might be this big, it might be a foot across. It is actually much huger than I could have ever imagined. It's like about this big across, and so there's all this water flowing across it. But this, again, is focusing on just this abstract, cool pattern that he saw out there in nature. And then this is a beautiful shot of Georgia O'Keeffe leaning up against this tree. One one of the things that he took away that was very important to him from this trip is that Georgia O'Keeffe oftentimes on the trail would point out something that was really interesting to her in terms of a shape or a form or a pattern. And I said this before when we did staff training, but I think probably a lot of the conversations they had on this trip, I won't say that they might have been pretentious, but they were maybe at a super high level in terms of like seriously considering the visual nature of all these different things. So I love the beauty of that shape, or look at the mountain, and really concentrating and focusing on that. So if you weren't an artist or weren't of an artistic mind, I don't know how entertaining it might have been for you. But anyway, so this is, she might have said like, oh, I love the way that that tree is silhouetted against the sky, and then Ansel Adams took her photo against the tree stump. So let's do a walk around a little bit. So that he got to take some abstract patterns of nature. He took some classic landscapes, and then he also did some really powerful portraits. And what's interesting, if you look at the portraits, is just the kind of differences iconographically between the ways that he shot the Rockefellers versus the way that he shot McAlpin. And so, because this was an album